The flames licked higher into the night sky, illuminating the darkness with an ominous orange glow as Clara Harper clutched her youngest child to her chest, her heart pounding with the terrible realization that they were trapped. The year was 1875, and what had begun as a peaceful evening in her modest two-story home on the outskirts of Silver Creek, Wyoming had transformed into a nightmare of crackling timber and billowing smoke. Clara had been widowed for just over a year, left alone to raise her 4 children after her husband, Thomas, had been thrown from his horse during a sudden thunderstorm. At 32 years of age, she had managed to keep their small homestead functioning through sheer determination and the occasional help from neighbors. But now, everything she had worked for was being devoured by the relentless flames below. "Mama, I'm scared," whispered 7-year-old Emma, her small face streaked with tears and soot as she clung to Clara's skirts. 10-year-old James stood protectively near his younger sisters, while 4-year-old Sarah continued to sob against Clara's shoulder. "We'll be all right," Clara assured them, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. The staircase had already collapsed in a shower of sparks, and the heat was intensifying by the moment. The window offered their only possible escape, but it was a 15-foot drop to the hard ground below, too dangerous for the children. "Help!" Clara screamed, pushing the window open wider and waving frantically. "Please, someone help us!" Her throat burned from the smoke she'd already inhaled, and a wave of dizziness threatened to overcome her. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and though several townsfolk had already gathered outside, watching in horror, none seemed capable of reaching them. Luke Blackwell had been riding back to town after delivering a herd of cattle to the railroad station when he saw the glow on the horizon. At 28, he'd spent the last decade of his life as a cowboy, drifting from ranch to ranch across the Western Territories. He had arrived in Silver Creek just 3 months prior, taking work at the Henderson Ranch and keeping mostly to himself. The townsfolk knew little about him beyond his impressive skills with horses and his tendency to avoid crowds. The moment he spotted the burning homestead, Luke spurred his horse forward, racing toward the commotion. As he approached, he could make out the silhouette of a woman at an upstairs window, her desperate cries carrying through the night air. "My children," she was shouting. "Please, someone save my children." Without hesitation, Luke leaped from his horse and pushed through the gathered onlookers. "Is there another way up there?" he demanded of a stunned-looking man at the edge of the crowd. "The stairs are gone," the man replied, shaking his head. "It's too late. That place is about to come down." Luke scanned the burning structure, his mind racing. The front door hung open, with smoke pouring out in thick plumes. Most of the first floor was engulfed in flames, but he noticed a section toward the back that seemed less consumed. "Is there a ladder?" he asked, but didn't wait for an answer. Spotting a long wooden ladder leaning against a nearby shed, he raced toward it, hauling it back to the burning house. "Help me with this." 2 men rushed forward, and together they positioned the ladder beneath the window where the trapped family waited. The heat was intense, causing Luke to shield his face as he tested the ladder's stability. "It won't reach all the way," one of the men said, his voice tight with fear. "It'll have to be close enough," Luke replied, already beginning to climb. "Madam," he called up to Clara, "I'm coming for you and your children." Clara's heart leaped with hope as she watched the stranger ascending toward them. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, turning to her children. "Someone's coming to help us." Luke reached the top of the ladder, still several feet below the window. "You'll need to lower them down to me," he called to Clara, extending his arms upward. "Quickly now," Clara nodded, her decision made instantly. "James," she said to her son, "you go first. Show your sisters how brave you are." The boy looked terrified but stepped toward the window determinedly. Clara helped him over the sill, instructing him to hang from his hands before letting go into the cowboy's waiting arms. Luke caught him securely, descending several rungs before passing the boy to the men waiting below. Without wasting a moment, Luke climbed back up. "Next one," he called, his voice rough from the smoke. One by one, Clara lowered Emma and then Sarah into Luke's strong arms, watching with overwhelming gratitude as he carried each child safely down the ladder. The baby, just 18 months old, would be the most difficult, and Clara wrapped little Abigail tightly in a blanket before preparing to hand her over. Just as Luke reached the top of the ladder for the 4th time, a tremendous crash sounded from inside the house. The floor beneath Clara's feet shuddered ominously. "Now," Luke shouted, his face streaked with soot, eyes intense in the firelight. "The house is going." Clara stretched as far as she could, passing her precious baby into the cowboy's secure grip. The moment Abigail was safely in his arms, another section of the floor collapsed behind Clara, sending her stumbling forward with a scream. "Jump," Luke commanded, already beginning his descent with the infant. "You have to jump now." Clara glanced behind her at the advancing flames, took a deep breath, and launched herself toward the ladder. Her hands connected with the upper rungs, but the sudden impact sent shock waves of pain through her wrists. She cried out as her grip faltered, and for a terrifying moment she was falling. Then a strong hand caught her arm, halting her descent. Luke had somehow managed to secure the baby with one arm while reaching out to grab Clara with the other. The ladder swayed precariously under their combined weight. "I've got you," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "Hold on to me." Together they descended as quickly as possible, the heat from the fire intensifying behind them. Just as they reached the ground, a final crack split the air as the second floor of the house collapsed entirely in an explosion of sparks and flame. Clara fell to her knees on the dirt, gathering her children to her as they rushed to her side. Through tears of relief and grief, she looked up at the cowboy, who had just risked his life repeatedly to save her family. "Thank you," she whispered, the words entirely inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. "You saved us all." Luke knelt beside her, passing baby Abigail gently into her arms. For the first time their eyes truly met, and something passed between them, a connection born in the midst of crisis. "Your children are safe," he said simply, his voice rough but kind. "That's what matters." As neighbors rushed forward with blankets and offers of shelter, Clara couldn't tear her gaze away from the stranger's face. She didn't even know his name, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would never forget him, or what he had done for her family that night. Luke Blackwell had intended to pass through Silver Creek like he had so many towns before it, leaving little trace of his presence. But as he watched Clara comforting her children, something shifted inside him, a realization that perhaps his wandering days might be coming to an end. The doctor arrived quickly to examine Clara and her children, finding them remarkably unharmed save for minor burns and the effects of smoke inhalation. Sheriff Tanner approached Luke, clapping him on the shoulder with genuine admiration. "That was the bravest thing I've seen in all my years, son," the older man said. "You're a hero, no question about it." Luke shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," the sheriff pointed out. "You did." Martha Wilson, the town's most prominent widow and owner of the local boarding house, stepped forward. "Mrs. Harper and her little ones will stay with me, of course," she announced, already organizing the other women to gather necessities for the displaced family. Luke nodded, relieved to know they would be taken care of. He found himself watching as Clara was helped to her feet, her youngest child still clutched to her chest. She turned, seeking him out in the crowd, their eyes meeting once more across the distance. "Mr. Blackwell," the sheriff said, "I don't believe you've formally met Mrs. Harper. Clara, this is Luke Blackwell. He's been working over at Henderson's place these past few months." Clara stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Luke's face. "Mr. Blackwell," she said softly, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done tonight." "No need for repayment, madam," Luke replied, suddenly conscious of his soot-covered appearance and rough manner. "I'm just glad I was passing by when I was." A small hand tugged at Luke's sleeve, and he looked down to find Emma gazing up at him with wide, solemn eyes. "Are you an angel?" the little girl asked seriously. "Mama says angels watch over us." Despite everything, Luke found himself smiling. "No, little one, I'm just a cowboy." "The bravest cowboy in all of Wyoming," James declared with the unwavering certainty of childhood, and the gathered crowd murmured in agreement. As the excitement began to settle, Luke stepped back, allowing Clara and her children to be guided toward Martha's waiting wagon. He intended to slip away quietly, uncomfortable with the attention and the strange feelings stirring within him, but Sheriff Tanner stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Henderson's place is 5 miles in the opposite direction," the lawman observed. "Where were you heading this time of night?" Luke hesitated, reluctant to admit he'd been planning to move on soon. Something about Silver Creek had begun to feel too confining, too settled for a man who'd spent his adult life avoiding roots of any kind. Yet now, watching Clara comfort her children in the wagon, he felt an unexpected pull to remain. "Just riding," he said finally, "clearing my head." The sheriff studied him knowingly. "Well, I expect Mrs. Harper will want to thank you properly once things settle. The Harpers have been good folks in this community for years. It's a blessing you came along when you did." As the wagon carrying Clara and her children pulled away, Luke found himself wondering about the family he had saved. The husband's absence was conspicuous, and the way the townspeople rallied around them suggested they'd already faced hardship before the fire. Despite his usual determination to keep emotional entanglements at arm's length, Luke found himself genuinely curious about the widow and her 4 brave children. The following morning found Luke at the boarding house, hat in hand, inquiring after the Harper family. He had spent a restless night, unable to shake the image of Clara's face illuminated by firelight, or the feeling of her hand gripping his as he helped her down the ladder. Martha Wilson answered the door herself, eyeing him with newfound respect. "Well, if it isn't our local hero," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "The Harpers are in the parlor. Clara's been asking after you." Luke followed the older woman through the tidy hallway, uncomfortable with both the hero title and the unexpected nervousness he felt at seeing Clara again. The parlor was a cozy room with floral wallpaper and sturdy furnishings. Clara sat on a settee with baby Abigail asleep in her arms, while her other children played quietly on the rug before the hearth. She looked up as he entered, and the smile that transformed her face made Luke's breath catch. Without the terror and smoke of the previous night, he could fully appreciate her beauty for the first time: the warm brown eyes, the soft curve of her cheek, the rich chestnut hair pulled back in a simple knot. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, rising carefully so as not to disturb the sleeping infant. "I was hoping you might call." Luke twisted his hat in his hands, suddenly feeling every bit the rough cowhand he was. "Just wanted to make sure you and the little ones were faring all right, madam." "Clara, please," she insisted. "After what you did for us, I think we can dispense with formalities." She gestured to a nearby chair. "Won't you sit for a moment?" As Luke settled awkwardly into the offered seat, the children noticed his presence. James approached first, standing tall as he extended his hand just as he'd seen men do in town. "Thank you for saving us, sir," the boy said solemnly. Luke shook the offered hand, touched by the child's earnest gratitude. "You were brave last night, son. Your pa would be proud." A shadow crossed Clara's face at the mention of her husband, but she quickly smoothed it away. Emma and Sarah soon gathered around as well, regarding their rescuer with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "Are you staying for breakfast, Mr. Blackwell?" Emma asked hopefully. "Mrs. Wilson makes the best flapjacks in the whole territory." "I don't want to impose," Luke began, but Clara interrupted him. "Please stay," she said. "It's the least we can offer." Something in her expression made it impossible for him to refuse, and Luke found himself nodding. "I'd be honored, Madam Clara," he corrected himself. Over breakfast, Luke learned more about the Harper family. Thomas Harper had died 14 months earlier, leaving Clara to manage their small farm and raise their children alone. The oldest, James, was trying his best to fill his father's shoes despite his young age. Emma was the thoughtful one, always with a book nearby. Sarah was the spirited child, full of questions and energy, while baby Abigail, born 3 months after her father's death, was the family's greatest joy and comfort. The house was almost paid for, Clara explained, a hint of despair creeping into her voice despite her obvious effort to remain strong. "I don't know what we'll do now." "The town will help," Martha assured her, refilling Luke's coffee cup. "We take care of our own in Silver Creek." Luke found himself studying Clara as she spoke, noting the quiet determination that seemed to radiate from her despite her circumstances. She caught him watching and held his gaze steadily, neither flirtatious nor uncomfortable with the attention. "Mr. Henderson has given me the day off," Luke found himself saying. "I could ride out to what's left of your place, see if anything might be salvaged." The hope that flickered across Clara's face was worth any inconvenience. "Would you?" "There are some things keepsakes of Thomas, the children's treasures that might have survived if they were stored in the root cellar." "I'll go right after breakfast," Luke promised, surprised by his own eagerness to help. True to his word, Luke rode out to the Harper homestead as soon as the meal was finished. The scene in daylight was even more devastating than it had appeared by night. The house was completely destroyed, with only the stone chimney standing amid the blackened rubble. The barn had been spared, however, along with the chicken coop and a small storage shed. Luke worked methodically through the wreckage, careful of hot spots still smoldering beneath the debris. The root cellar, as Clara had hoped, remained largely intact, and he was able to recover a trunk containing family documents, photographs, and mementos that had been stored there for safekeeping. In the barn, he found the family's 2 horses unharmed, along with a milk cow and several chickens pecking nervously at the ground. It was a small blessing amid the devastation, but Luke knew it would mean the world to Clara to know that her livestock had survived. He worked through the day, salvaging what he could and making a mental inventory of what would be needed to rebuild. It surprised him to realize he was already thinking in terms of reconstruction rather than simple recovery. There was something about Clara Harper and her children that had gotten under his skin in a way no one had managed in years. By late afternoon, Luke had loaded a wagon borrowed from a neighboring farm with the salvaged items and was leading the Harper animals back toward town. As he approached Silver Creek, he noticed a small crowd gathered outside the general store. Sheriff Tanner spotted him and waved him over. "Perfect timing, Blackwell," the lawman called. "We're just organizing a rebuilding effort for the Harper place. Figured we'd start this weekend if the weather holds." Luke reined in his horse, surprised by the community's swift response. "That's mighty generous. Like I said, we take care of our own," the sheriff replied. "And after what you did last night, seems you might be counted among that number now, whether you like it or not." The statement caught Luke off guard. He had spent so many years avoiding attachments, moving on whenever a place started to feel too familiar. Yet here he was, already entangled in the lives of Clara Harper and her children, and now the broader community as well. "I'd like to help," he found himself saying. "I've done some carpentry work in the past." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Good man, we'll need all hands available." He lowered his voice, adding, "It's been a hard road for Clara since Thomas passed. This fire, well, it could have broken a lesser woman, but she's strong, that one." Luke nodded, thinking of the quiet dignity Clara had displayed despite her overwhelming circumstances. "That she is," he agreed. When he returned to the boarding house with the recovered items, the joy on Clara's face was worth every hour of labor. She ran her fingers reverently over the family Bible and the small wooden box containing her wedding ring and Thomas's pocket watch, tears gathering in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see these things again," she whispered. "How can I ever thank you?" "The town's organizing a rebuilding effort," Luke told her. "They're planning to start this weekend." Clara looked up at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "And will you be part of that effort, Mr. Blackwell? Or will you be moving on by then?" The question was direct, and Luke realized she had somehow intuited his usual pattern of avoiding commitment. For a moment, he hesitated, old instincts urging him to maintain his distance. But the thought of riding away from Silver Creek from Clara and her children suddenly seemed impossible. "I'll be there," he said simply. The smile that illuminated her face in response settled something in Luke's chest, a restlessness he hadn't even fully acknowledged until that moment. For the first time in years, the thought of staying in one place didn't fill him with dread. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The townspeople of Silver Creek rallied around the Harper family, donating clothing, household items, and funds to help them rebuild. Luke found himself at the center of the reconstruction efforts, his experience in various building projects making him an unexpected asset. Clara, meanwhile, showed a resilience that impressed everyone. She insisted on being present at the homestead each day, helping where she could and keeping careful track of the rebuilding progress. The children accompanied her, with James proudly carrying tools for the workers and the girls helping Martha Wilson prepare meals for the volunteers. Luke and Clara found themselves working side by side often, their initial connection deepening through shared purpose and quiet conversations. He learned that she had come west as a bride at 19, following Thomas's dream of building a life in the frontier. She shared stories of the early struggles and triumphs, of learning to adapt to the harsh Wyoming winters, of the joy each child had brought to their lives. In turn, Luke found himself revealing pieces of his own past his childhood in Missouri, losing both parents to influenza when he was 16. The years spent drifting from ranch to ranch across the Western Territories. He didn't share everything, some wounds were still too raw, but it was more than he had told anyone in years. "Why Silver Creek?" Clara asked him one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house after the children had gone to bed. "Of all the places you've been, what made you stop here?" Luke considered the question, watching the last rays of sunlight stretching across the distant mountains. "Wasn't planning to stay," he admitted. "Henderson needed help with his spring roundup, offered good wages. Figured I'd move on once the work was done. And now?" Clara's voice was soft, her question hanging between them with unspoken weight. Luke turned to look at her, struck again by how the fading light softened her features, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek and the warmth in her eyes. "Now I'm not so sure moving on is what I want." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and a flush crept up her neck. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with possibility. Then baby Abigail cried out from inside, breaking the spell. Clara rose quickly. "I should check on her," she said, though her eyes lingered on his face a moment longer than necessary. As she disappeared inside, Luke leaned back in his chair, a strange mixture of emotions coursing through him. He had not come to Silver Creek looking for attachment, had certainly never expected to find himself drawn to a widow with 4 young children. Yet here he was, voluntarily building a house he had no claim to, spending his evenings in conversation with a woman who made him question every plan he'd ever made. The rebuilding of the Harper homestead progressed rapidly, with so many willing hands. By the end of 2 weeks, the frame of the new house stood proudly on the foundation, larger and sturdier than the original structure had been. Luke had suggested several improvements to the design, including a wider porch and larger windows to catch the morning light. Clara had embraced his suggestions enthusiastically. "It's as if you know exactly what I would have chosen myself," she told him one afternoon as they reviewed the plans. Thomas was practical above all else. The house served its purpose, but it was never really beautiful. "A home should be both," Luke said, "especially for a family like yours." The way she looked at him, then a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more personal, caused a tightness in his chest that was both uncomfortable and exhilarating. As the walls went up and the roof was secured, Luke found himself spending more and more time with the Harper children. James followed him everywhere, eager to learn and help. Emma would bring her books and read quietly nearby while he worked. Sarah peppered him with endless questions about everything from how nails were made to where clouds came from. Even baby Abigail seemed to have taken a shine to him, reaching for him with chubby hands whenever he came near. "They adore you," Clara observed one Sunday afternoon as they watched the children playing in the meadow beside the construction site. "James especially. He's needed a man to look up to." The comment stirred a mixture of pride and uncertainty in Luke. He had never considered himself role model material, had certainly never imagined forming attachments to children. Yet he couldn't deny the warmth he felt when James mastered a new skill under his guidance, or when Emma shared a story she thought he might enjoy, or when Sarah's face lit up at his arrival. "They're good kids," he said simply. "You've done a fine job with them." Clara smiled, though a shadow crossed her face. "I try, but there are days when I wonder if I'm enough for them. A child needs 2 parents." The statement hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Luke found himself studying her profile, admiring the quiet strength evident in the set of her jaw and the straight line of her shoulders. "You're more than enough," he told her firmly, "but that doesn't mean you have to do everything alone." Her eyes met his, searching for something in his expression. Whatever she found there caused her cheeks to flush slightly, but she didn't look away. "No," she agreed softly. "Perhaps I don't." The moment was interrupted by Sheriff Tanner riding up with a wagon loaded with windows and trim for the house. As the work resumed, Luke found himself watching Clara more than was strictly necessary, his thoughts in unfamiliar territory. That evening, as Luke prepared to ride back to the Henderson ranch, Clara approached him with a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Some bread and preserves," she explained, handing it to him. "And apple pie. The children insisted I send it with you." "Thank you," Luke said, accepting the basket. Their fingers brushed in the exchange and neither pulled away immediately. "Will you be out at the homestead tomorrow?" "In the afternoon," Clara confirmed. "Martha has offered to mind the children in the morning so I can help Mrs. Tanner with the sewing circle. They're making curtains for the new house. Luke nodded, suddenly reluctant to leave despite the late hour. The place should be fully enclosed by tomorrow. We can start on the interior work by the end of the week. It's remarkable how quickly it's coming together, Clara said, gazing in the direction of her homestead, though it was too far to see in the gathering dusk. I never expected such generosity. You're well loved in this community, Luke observed. Not surprising given the kind of person you are. The compliment brought a deeper flush to her cheeks. And what kind of person do you think I am, Mr. Blackwell? The formal address was teasing now, a reminder of how far they had come from their first meeting. Luke found himself smiling. The kind worth riding through fire for, he said quietly, the words more revealing than he'd intended. Clara's breath caught audibly, her eyes widening at the implication. For a tense moment, Luke thought he might have overstepped, but then she smiled, a soft, private smile that stirred something profound in his chest. Ride safely, Luke, she said, his name on her lips sending a current through him. I'll see you tomorrow. As he rode through the darkening landscape toward the Henderson ranch, Luke found himself at a crossroads more significant than any he had faced in his years of wandering. He had come to Silver Creek with no intention of staying, yet now he could hardly imagine leaving. The pull he felt toward Clara and her children was unlike anything he had experienced before, not just attraction, though that was certainly part of it, but a sense of rightness, of belonging, that both thrilled and terrified him. The next 3 weeks saw the Harper house transformed from a skeletal frame to a true home. The interior walls went up, floors were laid, and the women of Silver Creek contributed handmade curtains, quilts, and rugs to make the place welcoming. Throughout it all, Luke remained at the center of the effort, guiding the construction and spending every available moment with Clara and her children. The relationship between them deepened with each passing day, though neither had spoken openly of feelings beyond friendship. There were moments, a lingering glance, a hand held a beat too long, a private smile shared across a crowded room that suggested something more simmering beneath the surface, but both seemed hesitant to disrupt the comfortable rhythm they had established. Others were less circumspect in their observations. Martha Wilson watched the pair with knowing eyes, occasionally making comments about second chances that made Clara blush furiously. Sheriff Tanner had taken to clapping Luke on the shoulder whenever they met, treating him less like a drifter and more like a permanent resident. Even Henderson had grudgingly acknowledged that he expected Luke would be settling in for the long haul. The children, with the directness of youth, were the most transparent. James had taken to referring to when Luke comes home in a way that suggested he considered it inevitable. Emma asked Clara one evening, loudly enough for Luke to overhear, whether she thought Mr. Blackwell might ever want to read stories to them before bed like Papa used to. Sarah, never one for subtlety, had simply asked Luke if he might consider being their new father, causing both adults to choke on their coffee and hastily change the subject. On the day the house was finally completed, the entire town turned out for a celebration. Tables laden with food were set up in the yard. A fiddler played cheerful tunes, and children darted about in an impromptu game of tag. Clara stood on her new porch, baby Abigail on her hip, looking out at the gathering with tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. Luke found her there as the celebration was winding down, most of the townspeople having already departed for home. The older Harper children were playing a final game with the remaining youngsters under Martha's watchful eye. "It's a fine house," Luke said, coming to stand beside her. "Sturdy. Should stand for generations." Clara turned to him, her expression luminous in the golden light of sunset. "Because of you," she said softly. "I don't know how I'll ever repay everything you've done." Luke shook his head, uncomfortable as always with gratitude. The whole town helped. But you were the heart of it, Clara insisted. She paused, seeming to gather her courage before continuing. Luke, we haven't spoken about what happens now. His heart quickened at the direction of the conversation. What would you like to happen? Clara looked out at her children, a complex emotion crossing her face. When Thomas died, I never imagined I could feel this way again, that I could look at someone and see a future, a possibility. Her eyes returned to his face, direct and honest. But then you walked into our lives and everything changed. Luke took a step closer, close enough to catch the subtle scent of lavender that always seemed to surround her. Clara, you don't have to say anything, she hurried on. I know you've spent your life moving from place to place. I wouldn't presume to ask you to change who you are. But the children and we've grown very fond of you. And I thought you should know that if you were considering staying in Silver Creek, you would always be welcome here. The careful wording of her offer, the way she was giving him space to retreat if he wished, only made Luke more certain of what he wanted. With gentle deliberation, he reached out and took her hand in his. I've been thinking about buying some land, he said. The parcel that adjoins yours to the east is available. Good grazing, decent water access. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You're staying. If I have reason to, Luke replied, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Clara, I've spent my whole adult life running from connections, convinced that staying in one place meant being trapped. But these past weeks with you and the children, I've never felt more free, more myself, than I do when I'm with you. A soft gasp escaped her as she recognized the depth of what he was saying. Luke, I'm not proposing, he clarified quickly. Not yet. That would be too soon for both of us, but I am saying that I want to stay. I want to build something here, a ranch, a life. And I hope that in time you might consider allowing me to build that life with you and your children. Tears spilled onto Clara's cheeks as she listened, but her smile was radiant. I would consider it, she whispered, very favorably. Luke lifted his free hand to her face, gently brushing away a tear with his thumb. The tenderness of the gesture seemed to overcome the last of her reserve, and Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. May I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Please, she breathed. Their first kiss was gentle, a careful exploration that quickly deepened into something more profound. Luke felt as though he had been waiting his entire life for this moment, for this woman. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I never expected you, he confessed. I never expected any of this. Clara smiled, her hands resting lightly on his chest. Sometimes the things we don't expect are exactly what we need. From across the yard, Sarah's clear voice rang out. Mama's kissing Mr. Blackwell, she announced to anyone who could hear, causing James to groan in embarrassment and Emma to giggle behind her hands. Clara laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. Well, she said, I suppose that saves us having to make an announcement. Luke grinned, feeling lighter than he had in years. I don't mind if you don't. The coming months brought significant changes to Silver Creek and to the lives of Luke Blackwell and Clara Harper. True to his word, Luke purchased the land adjoining Clara's property and set about establishing his own ranch. He built a modest cabin on his land, but spent most of his time at the Harper homestead, helping with chores and gradually becoming an integral part of the family's daily life. The town watched with approval as the relationship between the widow and the cowboy blossomed. There were a few raised eyebrows at the speed of the courtship, but most agreed that, after what they had been through together, traditional timelines hardly seemed applicable. Clara flourished with Luke's steady presence in her life. The shadow of grief that had lingered in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet joy that was evident to anyone who knew her. The children, too, thrived under his influence, James developing confidence in his growing skills, Emma finding in Luke an appreciative audience for her stories, Sarah delighting in his patience with her endless questions, and even baby Abigail taking her first steps with his encouragement. By the time winter descended on Wyoming, bringing with it howling winds and deep snow, Luke and Clara had established a comfortable routine. He would spend his days working his land or helping with the Harper farm, join the family for supper, and often remain for the evening to help with bedtime stories before returning to his cabin. On Sundays, they attended church together, presenting a united front that the community recognized as a family in all but name. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and the Harper home warm with candlelight and pine boughs, Luke asked Clara to marry him. The children, who had been in on the secret, watched with barely contained excitement as she accepted through happy tears. They were married on a bright February morning in 1876, with the entire town in attendance. Sheriff Tanner stood as Luke's best man, while Martha Wilson, who had become like a mother to Clara, helped with the preparations. The Harper children participated enthusiastically, James proudly carrying the rings, Emma and Sarah strewing flower petals before their mother, and Abigail, now toddling confidently, being carried by Martha. As Clara walked toward him in a dress of soft blue silk, a gift from the women of the town, Luke felt a sense of homecoming unlike anything he had experienced before. This woman who had faced loss with such courage, who had rebuilt her life from ashes, both literal and figurative, was choosing to share her future with him. The magnitude of that gift left him momentarily speechless. "You look beautiful," he managed as she reached him, taking her hands in his. "So do you," she replied with a teasing smile, easing his nervousness. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the words they exchanged reflecting the journey that had brought them to this moment. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled townspeople nearly raised the church roof. The celebration that followed at the Harper, now Blackwell homestead, lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed half the territory. As Luke watched Clara laughing with her friends, her eyes bright with happiness, he marveled at how completely his life had changed in the span of a few short months. "Never seen a man look more besotted," Henderson remarked, joining Luke near the punch bowl. "Can't say I'm surprised, though. Mrs. Blackwell is a fine woman." "The finest," Luke agreed, unable to keep the pride from his voice. The older rancher studied him thoughtfully. "You know, when you first showed up looking for work, I gave you 6 months at most before the wanderlust took you. Would have bet money on it." "I would have agreed with you," Luke admitted. "Never planned on staying." "Fire has a way of changing things," Henderson observed, "burning away what's not important, leaving what matters." Luke's eyes found Clara across the room, now holding a sleepy Abigail while still managing to converse animatedly with Martha. "Yes," he said simply, "it does." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were tucked into bed, Luke and Clara stood together on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge in the clear winter sky. "Happy, Mrs. Blackwell?" Luke asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Clara leaned back against his chest, a content sigh escaping her. "More than I ever thought possible again," she admitted. "When Thomas died, I was certain that part of my life was over. And then the fire," she shook her head, still amazed by the turn of events. "If you hadn't been riding by that night." "But I was," Luke said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Right place, right time, Providence," Clara suggested, My grandmother would have called it God's hand at work. Luke considered this. He had never been particularly religious, but the chain of circumstances that had brought him to Clara's side that night did seem remarkably fortuitous. Whatever it was, I'm grateful. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, simply enjoying the peace of the moment and the warmth of each other's presence. You ever miss it? Clara asked suddenly. The freedom of moving on whenever you pleased. Luke didn't hesitate. Not once, he told her honestly. All those years, I thought I was chasing freedom, but I was really just running from connection, from the risk of caring too much. He turned her gently in his arms so he could see her face. What I've found here with you, with the children, it's worth any risk. Clara's eyes shimmered with emotion as she reached up to touch his face. I love you, Luke Blackwell. And I love you, he replied, the words still new enough to send a thrill through him. You and our children. The inclusion of the word our wasn't lost on Clara, whose smile widened. Our children, she repeated. They are, you know, yours now as much as mine. I know, Luke said, and he did. In the month since the fire, he had grown to love James, Emma, Sarah, and Abigail with a depth that sometimes startled him. They were his family now, a gift he had never expected to receive. As they went inside, closing the door against the winter cold, Luke reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. From a solitary drifter to a husband and father in the span of half a year, it was a transformation he couldn't have imagined on that fateful night when he'd first spotted the glow of fire on the horizon. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, bringing with it new growth and new beginnings. Luke's ranch was flourishing, with a small but growing herd of cattle and plans for expansion. The merger of his property with Clara's had created a promising operation that drew favorable comments from even the most established ranchers in the area. More significant than the business success, however, was the blending of their lives. Luke had officially adopted the Harper children, giving them his name and his unconditional love. The adjustment hadn't always been smooth. James occasionally tested boundaries, and there had been moments of confusion and tears as they all learned to navigate their new family dynamic. But the overwhelming sentiment was one of rightness, of pieces falling into place. On a warm May evening, as they sat together on the porch after the children were in bed, Clara shared news that would change their lives once more. I went to see Doc Wilson today, she began, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Luke immediately sat up straighter, concern evident in his expression. Are you ill? Not ill, Clara assured him, reaching for his hand. Luke, I'm expecting a baby, our baby. For a moment he could only stare at her, processing the information. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing until it seemed to illuminate his entire being. A baby, he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. When? November, the doctor thinks, Clara replied, her own smile matching his. Are you happy? In answer, Luke gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that conveyed what words could not. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, he said when he could finally speak. Clara, it's incredible. She relaxed against him, relief evident in her posture. I wasn't sure how you'd feel. We haven't really discussed having more children. I hadn't dared to hope for it, Luke admitted. Having you and the children already seemed like more good fortune than any man deserves. Clara lifted her head to look at him, her expression serious. You deserve every happiness, Luke Blackwell. Don't ever doubt that. He kissed her then, pouring into the gesture all the love and gratitude he felt. When they parted, he kept her close, one hand moving to rest gently over her still flat stomach. Have you told the children yet? He asked. Clara shook her head. I wanted you to be the first to know. We can tell them together tomorrow. The following morning, they gathered the children in the family room before breakfast. James, now 11, looked concerned at the serious tone of the meeting. Emma, approaching her 9th birthday, watched her mother's face carefully, always sensitive to emotional undercurrents. Sarah, 5 years old and irrepressible as ever, bounced on her seat with impatience. Abigail, just past her 2nd birthday, sat contentedly in Luke's lap, playing with his watch fob. "We have something important to tell you," Clara began, taking Luke's free hand in hers. "Something wonderful." "Are we getting a pony?" Sarah interrupted hopefully, causing both adults to laugh. "Not exactly," Luke said, "though that's not a bad idea for the future." Clara squeezed his hand, then looked at each child in turn. "In the fall, our family is going to grow. You're going to have a new little brother or sister." The reactions were immediate and varied. James looked stunned, then pleased. Emma gasped, her hands flying to her mouth before she broke into a delighted smile. Sarah whooped with excitement, already planning all the things she would teach the baby. Abigail, not entirely comprehending, clapped her hands because everyone else seemed happy. "Is it in your tummy like Abby was?" Sarah asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Clara nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her midsection. "Yes, the baby is growing inside me right now, though it's still very tiny." "When will it come out?" Emma wanted to know, always practical. "Around November," Luke answered. Just before Thanksgiving. James had been quiet, processing the news in his thoughtful way. Finally, he spoke up. "Will this be our real brother or sister? I mean, since Luke is." He trailed off, uncertain how to express the complex family relationships. Luke met the boy's gaze steadily. "James, you and Emma and Sarah and Abby are my children in every way that matters. I couldn't love you more if you had been born to me." He paused, making sure the message was clear. "This new baby won't change that. It will just mean one more person for all of us to love." The sincerity in his voice seemed to reassure James, who nodded and offered a small smile. "I think that'll be nice," he decided, "having a bigger family." As the children excitedly discussed the news, debating whether they wanted a brother or sister, suggesting increasingly outlandish names, and asking questions that ranged from insightful to amusingly naive, Luke and Clara exchanged a look of profound contentment. The family they were building together, forged in the crucible of tragedy and unlikely rescue, was continuing to grow and strengthen. The coming months brought both challenges and joys. As Clara's pregnancy progressed, she found herself increasingly reliant on Luke and the older children for help with daily tasks. The summer heat was particularly trying, but Luke made sure she rested in the shade during the hottest parts of the day, often reading to her or simply sitting in companionable silence while she dozed. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Luke's expertise with cattle complemented Clara's knowledge of crop rotation and local growing conditions. By August, they had one of the most productive operations in the county, drawing favorable comments from neighbors who had initially been skeptical of the hasty marriage. In early November, as the first snow dusted the mountains in the distance, Clara went into labor. Martha Wilson came to stay with the children while Luke drove Clara to town in the wagon, his face a mask of concern despite her reassurances that all was proceeding normally. For 18 hours, Luke paced the waiting room of Doc Wilson's small office, alternating between prayer and quiet panic. When the doctor finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, Luke felt his heart restart. "Congratulations, Mr. Blackwell," the older man said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You have a son, a strong, healthy boy." Luke's legs nearly gave out beneath him. "And Clara, tired but well. She's asking for you." Nothing could have prepared Luke for the sight of Clara holding their son, a tiny, perfect being with a shock of dark hair and his mother's delicate features. As he approached the bed, Clara looked up at him with a tired smile that illuminated the room more effectively than any lamp. "Meet your son," she said softly, adjusting the blanket so Luke could see the baby's face more clearly. "Thomas Lucas Blackwell, if you approve." Luke swallowed hard against the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. The honor of having his son named partly for Clara's first husband, a recognition of the man who had been father to their older children, and partly for himself, moved him deeply. "It's perfect," he managed, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "He's perfect." Clara leaned against him, her exhaustion evident but her joy palpable. "Would you like to hold him?" With infinite care, Luke gathered his son into his arms, marveling at how something so small could immediately claim such an enormous portion of his heart. "Hello, Thomas," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your pa." As if in response, the baby's eyes fluttered open, briefly dark blue like all newborns, but with a directness that seemed to penetrate straight to Luke's soul. In that moment, the circle of love and commitment that had begun on the night of the fire felt complete. The homecoming was a joyous occasion, with the older children crowding around to see their new brother. James approached with characteristic caution, Emma with gentle curiosity, Sarah with barely contained excitement, and Abigail with wide-eyed wonder at the tiny being who had joined their family. "He's so small," James observed, peering into the bundle Clara held. "You were this small once," Luke told him, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "All of you were." "Even you, Pa?" Sarah asked, looking up at Luke with complete seriousness. The word Pa still had the power to catch him off guard with its simple profundity. The children had gradually shifted from calling him Luke to the more familial term over the past months, each making the transition in their own time. Sarah had been the first, James the last to make the change. "Even me," Luke assured her with a smile. "A long time ago." As winter settled over Wyoming, the Blackwell household found its rhythm with the new addition. Thomas proved to be a contented baby, with Clara's serene disposition, and what Luke proudly claimed was his own healthy appetite. The older children adapted to their new roles with enthusiasm, each finding ways to help with their little brother. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Luke had proposed, the family gathered around the hearth in their comfortable home. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the world in pristine white. Inside, warmth and love filled every corner of the house that had risen from the ashes of tragedy. Luke sat beside Clara on the settee, baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in his arms while the older children played a game on the rug before the fire. The scene of domestic tranquility was so far removed from his former life of solitary wandering that sometimes he could hardly believe it was real. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked quietly, noticing his contemplative expression. Luke smiled, shifting Thomas slightly as the baby stirred in his sleep. "About how different everything is from what I expected. A year ago today, I was still trying to convince myself I could be the kind of man who stays. And now," Clara prompted, her hand finding his. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else," Luke admitted. "You, the children, our home, it's everything I never knew I wanted." Clara's eyes softened with understanding. "Sometimes we have to lose our way before we can find where we truly belong." As Luke looked around at the family he had never expected to have, he reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought him here. A chance decision to take work in a small Wyoming town, a night ride that led him past a burning house, 4 trips through smoke and flame that had changed the course of not just Clara's life, but his own as well. "I'm glad I got lost," he told her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And even more glad that I found you." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering any traces of the past and creating a clean slate for the future, a future that Luke Blackwell, once a solitary drifter, now faced with a full heart and the certainty that he had finally found his way home. 5 years passed, bringing both challenges and joys to the Blackwell family. The ranch flourished under Luke and Clara's careful management, expanding to become one of the most respected operations in the territory. The children grew and thrived, James apprenticing with a local carpenter while still helping on the ranch, Emma excelling in her studies with ambitions of becoming a teacher, Sarah charming everyone with her boundless energy and quick wit, Abigail developing a remarkable talent for music, and young Thomas taking his first steps in his father's footsteps, already showing a natural affinity for horses and cattle. The family welcomed another addition 2 years after Thomas, a daughter they named Grace, whose arrival completed their family circle. With 6 children ranging from toddlerhood to adolescence, the Blackwell household was rarely quiet, but always filled with love and laughter. On the anniversary of the fire each year, the family observed a quiet tradition. They would gather on the porch after dinner, and Luke would tell the story of that night, how he happened to be riding by, how brave each child had been, how Clara's strength had inspired him. The telling evolved as the years passed, with the older children adding details from their own memories, the younger ones listening with wide-eyed wonder at a pivotal event they had either been too young to remember or had not yet been born to witness. And then, Luke would always conclude, looking at Clara with the same devotion that had grown only stronger with time, "I knew that I had found something worth staying for." The story served as a reminder of how precarious life could be, how quickly everything could change, and how sometimes the most devastating circumstances could lead to unexpected blessings. It was a lesson none of them would ever forget, how from the ashes of loss, the most beautiful new beginnings could emerge. On a warm summer evening in 1882, as Luke and Clara sat together on the porch watching their children play in the yard, she leaned her head against his shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever think about how different our lives might have been?" she asked. "If you hadn't been riding by that night." Luke's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at what we've built together and I can't imagine any other path." Clara smiled, watching as James hoisted little Grace onto his shoulders, the little girl's delighted laughter floating across the yard. "Neither can I," she said softly. "This is exactly where we're meant to be." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Luke Blackwell reflected on the journey that had brought him from solitary drifter to beloved husband and father. The fire that had once threatened everything Clara held dear had ultimately forged a bond between them that nothing could break, a love born in crisis, tested by time, and strengthened by the family they had built together. It was, he thought as he pressed a kiss to Clara's temple, the most beautiful kind of unexpected blessing. And as their children called for them to join in their game, Luke took his wife's hand and stepped forward into the life that had been waiting for him all along, a life he had found, against all odds, by making 4 desperate trips through smoke and flame on a night that had changed everything.